Hello, Night Seekers, and welcome to Lacuna Noir. This is where forgotten stories and gentle voices meet, carrying you softly into peaceful sleep, wrapped in mystery. Before tonight's stories begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? Drop a comment below and let me know. And a little note before we begin. You may notice a few brief ads in the first 10 minutes, but after that, the rest of the video is completely ad-free. Just you, the silence, and the stories. So settle in, get comfortable, and let the night carry you. If you're drawn to these quiet, shadowed nights, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the bell so you never miss a story when darkness calls. A few years ago, I decided to take a walk through a stretch of woodland that most people never visited. It wasn't part of any marked trail. I liked wandering away from the main paths because it was usually quiet, peaceful, and felt like a place where the outside world disappeared for a while. There were no other people around that day. The only sounds were birds calling in the distance, the wind moving through the trees, and the occasional snap of branches beneath my boots. I had been walking for quite a while when I noticed a strange smell drifting through the air. At first it was faint enough that I thought it might just be stagnant water or some kind of dead animal hidden nearby. Woods are full of natural smells, especially during the warmer months, and sometimes they can be unpleasant. I didn't think much of it and kept walking. But with every step, the smell became stronger. It wasn't just unpleasant anymore. It was overwhelming. It had an oddly sweet smell mixed with something rotten that immediately made my stomach tighten. It was unlike anything I had ever experienced before. The smell seemed to stick inside my nose, and no matter how much I tried breathing through my mouth, I could still taste it. I stopped walking and looked around. Curiosity got the better of me. The smell seemed to be coming from a patch of thick bushes a short distance away from where I was standing. The undergrowth was dense enough that I couldn't see more than a few feet inside it. For a moment, I considered walking away. Whatever was causing that smell clearly wasn't something I wanted to find. But I couldn't help myself. I carefully pushed the branches aside and stepped closer. Almost immediately, I saw something lying on the ground beneath the trees. At first, my brain refused to understand what I was looking at. Then, everything suddenly clicked into place. It was a person, or at least what had once been a person. He had obviously been there for quite some time. His body had swollen dramatically, and the skin had turned shades of green, black, and gray. Parts of his clothing were still recognizable, but much of him no longer looked human. The local wildlife had clearly found him long before I had. Insects covered large parts of the body, and there were signs that animals had been feeding on him for days. I froze. Every instinct told me to run. Instead, I just stood there, staring. The smell was so powerful now that I started gagging. My eyes watered, and I had to turn away several times just to catch my breath. I'd never seen a dead body before. Nothing prepares you for it. Movies make death look clean. Real life doesn't. Eventually, I forced myself to step back and grab my phone with shaking hands. I called the police, trying to explain where I was turned out to be harder than I expected because I wasn't anywhere near an official trail. I had to describe landmarks, nearby roads, and roughly how far I had walked into the woods. The operator stayed calm while asking questions. They wanted to know if I was absolutely certain it was a body. I said yes. There wasn't any doubt. After getting my location as accurately as possible, they told me officers were on the way. Then they asked something I wasn't expecting. They told me to stay where I was until they arrived. I understood why. They probably didn't want anyone disturbing the scene or accidentally walking away before they could ask questions. Still, I wasn't thrilled about the idea. I was completely alone in the middle of nowhere with a dead body only a few yards away. There wasn't really much choice. So, I stayed. Time seemed to slow down. Every minute felt much longer than it actually was. The woods had felt peaceful before I found him. Now they felt completely different. Every sound suddenly seemed important. Branches creaking, leaves moving, birds suddenly going silent. Every little noise made me look over my shoulder. I knew there was no reason to be afraid. The man was dead. Whatever had happened here was already over. But logic doesn't always matter when you're sitting alone in the middle of a forest with a human body nearby. As the afternoon wore on, the sunlight slowly faded behind the trees. The shadows grew longer. Eventually, it started getting dark. The officers had warned me that reaching my location would take time because of how isolated the area was. I hadn't realized just how long it would actually feel. Once darkness settled over the woods, everything became even worse. The forest changed completely at night. The familiar landscape disappeared. The trees became black shapes surrounding me from every direction. Every sound seemed louder. I couldn't stop thinking about the body lying only a short distance away. I tried not to look in that direction. I kept telling myself there was nothing there except a dead man. Still, I found myself imagining movement every time the wind shifted the bushes. I checked my phone repeatedly. No signal, just enough battery to keep the flashlight running. So I sat there, in the dark, waiting. At some point, I started talking quietly to myself. Not because I expected an answer, just because hearing my own voice somehow made me feel less alone. Finally, after what felt like forever, I saw flashing blue lights through the trees. I've never been so relieved to see police officers in my life. They reached me, secured the area, and immediately began treating it as a crime scene. I answered their questions as best I could. I explained exactly how I had found him. They thanked me for staying. After giving my statement, I was finally allowed to leave. I drove home in complete silence. I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him exactly as he had been lying in the woods. The colors, the smell, the insects, everything replayed over and over. A few days later, I was contacted again. The police informed me that the man had taken his own life. There was no evidence that anyone else had been involved. As tragic as it was, the investigation quickly confirmed there had been no foul play. Knowing what had happened should have brought some kind of closure. Instead, it somehow made everything feel even sadder. Someone had walked into those woods completely alone, knowing they were never coming back. Then they had remained there for days until I happened to wander off the trail and find them. I tried to move on. Life eventually returned to normal, at least on the surface. But my sleep never fully recovered. The dreams started within a week. At first, they were simple. I would be back in those woods, following the same path. Everything looked exactly the way it had that day. The same trees, the same silence, the same strange smell drifting through the air. No matter which direction I walked, I always ended up standing in front of those bushes again. Every single dream ended the same way. I reached out, pulled the branches aside, and woke up before seeing what was underneath. After a while, the dreams changed. Now I actually saw him. Except he wasn't dead anymore. He was sitting exactly where I had found him. His body still looked exactly the same. Swollen, discolored, covered in dirt and leaves. But his eyes were open. He would simply stare at me. At first, he never spoke. He only watched. Somehow, that silence was worse than anything he could have said. Then, one night, he finally spoke. His voice didn't sound loud. It was calm, almost conversational. He asked me why I disturbed him. I tried explaining that I hadn't known he was there. He didn't seem interested in my answer. He just kept saying that I should have left him alone, that he had finally found peace until I came along. Every dream after that became more unsettling. Each time he remembered me. Each time he seemed angrier. Sometimes he stood up. Sometimes he slowly walked toward me. Sometimes he stayed exactly where he was and simply watched while repeating the same words. You should have left me. Eventually, the dreams became darker. He started telling me that I should join him, that I understood what it was like now, that I belonged there too. He would calmly tell me to kill myself. Not shouting, not threatening, just speaking as if he were making a perfectly reasonable suggestion. That calmness made it far more disturbing than if he had been screaming. I'd wake up covered in sweat with my heart pounding so hard that it felt like it would burst out of my chest. For months, I dreaded going to sleep. I knew it was almost certainly my own mind trying to process something deeply traumatic. Finding a body isn't something most people ever experience. Finding one in that condition is something even fewer people forget. The brain has strange ways of dealing with shock. Even knowing that didn't make the dreams feel any less real while they were happening. Over time, they became less frequent. Weeks passed without one. Then months. Eventually, I thought they had finally stopped. But every now and then, they still return. Usually when I've almost forgotten about everything. I'll have one perfectly ordinary day. Go to bed without thinking about any of it. Then suddenly, I'm back in those woods again. The smell reaches me before I see anything. The trees look exactly the same. The path never changes. I already know what's waiting behind those bushes before I even get there. Sometimes, in the dream, I try walking away. It never works. No matter which direction I choose, I somehow end up standing in front of that same place again. Then I hear his voice behind me. Quiet, patient, waiting, even now, years later. I can still remember that smell better than almost anything else about that day. People often say that certain smells stay with you forever. They're right. Some memories fade around the edges. That one never has. Every now and then, usually after telling someone this story or thinking about it for too long, he'll appear in my dreams again. Maybe it's nothing more than my imagination trying to make sense of a deeply disturbing memory. Maybe it's simply how my mind chose to deal with the shock of discovering someone who had died alone in the woods. I honestly hope that's all it is. But every time I wake from one of those dreams, it takes me a few long moments to remind myself that I'm safely in my own bed, miles away from those woods. Even after all these years, part of me still expects to open my eyes and find myself sitting alone in the darkness, surrounded by silent trees, with that sweet, sickening smell drifting through the night once again. About 2 years ago, I was driving home late at night after a family reunion. Everyone else was staying over, but I had to be back at work early the next morning, so I decided to make the 2-hour drive home instead. At first, everything was fine. The roads were quiet, the weather was clear, and I had some music playing to keep myself awake. It wasn't a highway for most of the trip either. The route took me through long stretches of narrow roads surrounded by thick trees and dense bushes on both sides. They were the kind of roads you only ever seem to see in horror movies, isolated, dark, and with almost no streetlights. Every few minutes another car would pass, but apart from that, I was completely alone. About 45 minutes into the drive, exhaustion hit me all at once. It wasn't the kind of tiredness that slowly creeps up on you. It felt like someone had flipped a switch. One minute I was perfectly alert, and the next I was struggling to keep my eyes open. My eyelids suddenly felt heavy, and I found myself blinking longer than I should have. I rolled the windows down. I turned the music up louder. I even slapped my own face a couple of times, hoping it would wake me up. Nothing worked. I knew how dangerous it was to keep driving like that. I kept telling myself I just needed to find somewhere safe to pull over for 20 or 30 minutes. Even a short nap would be enough to make the rest of the drive manageable. The problem was that there was nowhere to stop. There were no gas stations, no restaurants, no rest areas, not even a small parking lot, just miles of dark road cutting through endless woods. As the minutes passed, I became more desperate. My head started nodding forward every now and then before I caught myself. Every time it happened, my heart raced because I knew how close I was to falling asleep behind the wheel. Eventually, I made a decision that I immediately knew wasn't a good one. I spotted a grassy area beside the road that was partially hidden behind a line of thick bushes. It wasn't really a parking spot. It was more like a small clearing where maintenance vehicles might occasionally pull off the road. Without thinking too much about it, I turned off the road, drove onto the grass, and positioned my car behind the bushes so it couldn't easily be seen by passing traffic. Looking back now, it was a terrible decision. At the time, though it felt like my only option, I checked the dashboard clock before closing my eyes. 11:22 p.m. I remember thinking that I would only sleep for 20 minutes. I locked the doors, leaned my seat back, and almost instantly fell asleep. I don't know how long I had been sleeping before something pulled me awake. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The sound was faint, but close enough that it immediately dragged me out of sleep. For a second, I had no idea where I was. Then I remembered the drive, the road, the trees, the bushes hiding my car. Still half asleep, I looked at the clock. 11:50. Only 28 minutes had passed. The scratching continued for another few seconds before suddenly stopping. I sat quietly, listening. Nothing. Not even the sound of footsteps. The woods were completely silent. I figured it had probably been a branch rubbing against the car or maybe some small animal sniffing around. I was still unbelievably tired. Without even looking outside, I shrugged it off, closed my eyes, and went back to sleep. The second time I woke up was completely different. Scratch, 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 only now it wasn't stopping. The noise continued over and over, slow, deliberate, like something was dragging its fingers across the outside of the car. My eyes snapped open. I looked at the clock. 12:40 a.m. Almost an hour had passed. The scratching was still going. This time it felt much louder than before. I stayed perfectly still. My breathing slowed as I listened. It didn't sound random anymore. It sounded intentional. For a few seconds, I tried convincing myself it had to be an animal. Maybe a raccoon, maybe a fox, maybe even a deer brushing against the side of the car. But then another thought crossed my mind. If it had been an animal earlier, why had it come back almost an hour later? The timing didn't make any sense. The scratching continued. Slow, patient, almost like whoever, or whatever, was outside wasn't in any hurry. I didn't dare turn around immediately. Instead, I slowly lifted my eyes toward the rearview mirror. Because of the darkness, I couldn't see much. The bushes behind my car blended into the trees until everything looked like one giant black wall. Then, just for a split second, I caught movement. Something darted away from the back of my car and disappeared into the woods. It happened so fast that I couldn't make out any details. All I saw was a dark shape disappearing between the trees. Immediately, my brain jumped to every scary story I'd ever heard. There was one old urban legend in particular that popped into my head. The Hooked Man. The story about the couple parked on a lonely road who heard scratching outside their car. The boyfriend got out to investigate. He never came back. People always laughed at stories like that. At that moment, I wasn't laughing. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it. Every instinct told me the same thing. Leave now. I shoved the key into the ignition, started the engine, and pulled back onto the road without another second of hesitation. I didn't even look behind me. I just wanted to get as far away from that place as possible. The road curved sharply less than 100 yards ahead. As I rounded the bend, my headlights suddenly lit up another vehicle. It was parked on the side of the road. At first, I thought someone else had also stopped to rest. Then I noticed something strange. The driver's door was standing wide open. The interior light was glowing faintly. The engine wasn't running. There was no movement inside. I slowed down slightly as I passed. I couldn't help looking. The driver's seat was empty. So was the passenger seat. Nobody was inside. A cold feeling settled in my stomach. Where had the driver gone? I checked my mirrors. Nothing. The road behind me looked empty. I was just starting to convince myself that maybe whoever owned the car had stepped into the woods for some reason when everything changed. Out of nowhere, a man burst around the corner behind me. He wasn't walking. He was sprinting. He ran directly into the middle of the road, waving both arms wildly. At first I thought he might be injured. Then I rolled my window down just enough to hear what he was shouting. Hey! Hey you! Get out of your car! Now. His voice wasn't calm. It wasn't desperate either. It sounded angry, demanding, as if he expected me to obey him. For one brief second, I actually considered stopping. Maybe he genuinely needed help. Maybe his car had broken down. Maybe there had been some kind of emergency. Then, I looked at him properly. Even in the headlights, something felt wrong. He wasn't pointing toward his car. He wasn't asking me to call for help. He wasn't saying someone was hurt. He was only shouting one thing, for me to get out of my car, over and over again. Every survival instinct I had kicked in at once. I hit the accelerator. Hard, the engine roared as the car surged forward. I watched him disappear into my rearview mirror, still running after me for a few seconds before he eventually stopped. I never slowed down. I didn't stop at the next town. I didn't stop until I reached a brightly lit gas station many miles away. Only then did I finally pull over. I sat there gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my hands actually hurt. My heart was still racing. I replayed everything in my head. The scratching, the figure running into the woods, the abandoned-looking car, the man screaming at me to get out. None of it made any sense. Part of me wondered if the scratching had been him. Maybe he had found my hidden car while walking through the bushes. Maybe he had been trying to see if anyone was inside. Maybe when I drove away, he ran back to his own vehicle and tried to stop me before I escaped. Or maybe the scratching really had been an animal, and the man had absolutely nothing to do with it. I honestly don't know. I've gone over that night in my head countless times, trying to come up with a logical explanation. Maybe his own car had broken down. Maybe he simply wanted someone to help him. Maybe he panicked when I drove away. But if that was true, why demand that I get out of my vehicle instead of asking me to call the police or request roadside assistance? Why was his driver's door left wide open? Why was he alone on that road in the middle of the night? And most importantly, what or who had been scratching at my car almost an hour before I ever saw him? Those questions have never really left me. Looking back now, I realize how many bad decisions I made that night. I never should have driven while I was that exhausted. I definitely never should have hidden my car behind bushes on the side of an isolated road where nobody could easily see me. If I had simply stopped at a well-lit gas station before I became dangerously tired, none of it would have happened. To this day, I have no idea what that man's intentions actually were. Maybe he was harmless. Maybe he genuinely needed assistance. Or maybe leaving when I did was the best decision I made all night. Whatever the truth is, I wasn't interested in finding out. I never saw him again. I never drove that route late at night after that. And if there's one lesson I took away from the whole experience, it's this. No matter how tired you are, never pull over to sleep on the side of a deserted road hidden behind bushes in the middle of nowhere. It might seem like the safest option when you're exhausted, but sometimes the place that feels hidden from everyone else also hides everyone else from you. When something starts scratching at your car in the middle of the night, and the only person you meet afterward is a stranger demanding that you step outside, you realize just how vulnerable you really are. I was lucky enough to drive away. Whether I escaped a harmless misunderstanding or something much worse, I'll never know. And honestly, after all this time, I don't think I want the answer. My house has always had a strange layout compared to every other house on the street. While most of my neighbors have homes that sit fairly close to the sidewalk, mine is built much farther back on the lot. A long concrete walkway stretches from the sidewalk all the way to the front porch, almost like a narrow path leading directly to the front door. The design has never really made much sense to me. The front door opens straight into the living room instead of a hallway, and nearly the entire front wall is made up of huge floor-to-ceiling windows. During the day, they're great because they let in an incredible amount of natural light. The room always feels bright and open, even on cloudy afternoons. The downside is that everyone walking past can practically see inside. The windows don't open, and there are no bushes or trees large enough to block the view. At night, when the lights are on inside and it's dark outside, it almost feels like living in a glass display case. Anyone standing outside can look directly into the room. I've always found that a little unsettling. A couple of years ago, my parents and the rest of my family left town for a week-long vacation. I stayed behind because I had work and couldn't get the time off. For the first time in a long while, I had the entire house to myself. At first, it sounded amazing. No noise, no interruptions, no one asking questions. Just me. I decided I was going to enjoy the rare freedom while I had it. That first evening, I picked up plenty of alcohol on my way home from work. Nothing fancy, just enough to relax and enjoy having the house to myself. One drink turned into several. Then, several turned into far too many. By the time the evening was over, I was completely drunk. I remember stumbling through the house, laughing at absolutely nothing, feeling invincible the way alcohol sometimes tricks you into feeling. Around 9 o'clock, I thought about going upstairs to my bedroom. I even started walking toward the hallway. Then, I stopped. For some reason that I still can't fully explain, the idea of walking through the dark house suddenly made me uneasy. The alcohol wasn't helping. Every dark doorway looked a little darker than usual. Every shadow seemed deeper. I laughed at myself for being ridiculous. Still, instead of making the trip upstairs, I threw myself onto the couch in the living room. It seemed easier. The couch sat directly beneath those massive front windows. If I reached up while standing on the cushions, I could almost touch the bottom of the glass. I remember pulling a blanket over myself, turning off the television, and closing my eyes. Within minutes, I was asleep. I have no idea how long I slept before I suddenly woke up. There wasn't any loud noise, no obvious reason. 1 second, I was completely asleep. The next, I was wide awake. For a few moments, I simply lay there, staring into the darkness. Something felt wrong. I couldn't explain it. The house was completely silent, yet every hair on my arms was standing up. A wave of chills ran through my entire body. Not the kind you get because you're cold, the kind you get when your brain is trying to tell you something before you've consciously realized it. I stayed perfectly still. Then I heard it. Bang! The sound came from directly above me. It was so sudden and so loud that every muscle in my body tightened. Another bang followed almost immediately. Then another. Someone was hitting the window. Not tapping, not knocking politely. Pounding, the glass shook with every impact. I didn't move. I don't know why. Maybe because I was still half asleep. Maybe because I was terrified. Instead of sitting up, I slowly opened my eyes and looked toward the window above the couch. At first, all I could see was darkness. Then, my eyes adjusted. There was someone standing outside. I couldn't make out their face. The light inside the living room reflected off the glass, making whoever was outside appear mostly as a dark silhouette. But there was no mistaking what they were doing. They had one arm raised and were repeatedly slamming their fist against the window. Bang, bang, bang. Each hit echoed through the empty house. I felt completely frozen. My phone was sitting on the coffee table several feet away, close enough to reach under normal circumstances. It may as well have been across the room. I was too afraid to move. Without lifting my head, I shifted my eyes toward the cable box beneath the television. The digital clock glowed faintly. 3:02 a.m. Seeing the time somehow made everything feel worse. Who pounds on someone's window at 3 o'clock in the morning? The banging continued. Slow, steady, relentless. I kept waiting for whoever it was to give up and leave. They didn't. Every few seconds, another heavy impact shook the glass. I remember wondering whether the window would eventually break. It felt strong enough to hold, but I wasn't exactly eager to find out. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, silence, the pounding stopped. The person outside didn't immediately walk away. At least I don't think they did. I couldn't hear footsteps. I couldn't hear voices. Just silence. I still refused to move. Every instinct told me that whoever had been outside might still be standing there. Waiting, the quiet lasted maybe 20 seconds. Then everything exploded at once. Bang! The window shook again. At exactly the same moment, boom, someone slammed both fists against the front door. I nearly screamed. There wasn't just one person anymore. There were two. One continued pounding on the huge living room window directly above my head. The other began hammering on the front door only a few feet away. The sounds overlapped. Window, door, back and forth, over and over again. Neither of them spoke. That was somehow the worst part. No yelling, no calling my name, no asking if anyone was home, just constant pounding. It almost felt coordinated, as if they knew exactly where I was lying. I remember thinking that if they simply wanted help, they would have shouted something. If they were at the wrong house, they would have realized their mistake after a minute or two. Instead, they just kept hitting the glass and the door. Whoever they weren't trying to get my attention anymore. They already had it. I lay perfectly still beneath the window. My breathing was so shallow that my chest barely moved. Some irrational part of me convinced itself that if they couldn't see me moving, maybe they'd think the house was empty. Looking back, that probably made no sense. The living room lights were off, but they had almost certainly seen me asleep on the couch before I woke up. Those windows offered almost no privacy at night. If someone stood close enough, they could probably see everything. That thought made me feel even more exposed. I was lying there completely helpless, while strangers stood only inches away on the other side of the glass. The pounding continued, minute after minute. At one point, I thought about calling 911, but every scenario running through my mind ended with one of them hearing me speak, or seeing the glow from my phone, or realizing exactly where I was. So I stayed absolutely still. Listening, waiting time completely lost its meaning. It felt like hours. In reality, it was probably much less than that. Still, every second dragged by painfully slowly. Occasionally, one of them would stop for several moments, just long enough for me to hope they had finally left. Then another deafening bang would hit the glass again. My heart jumped every single time. Eventually, I noticed my hands were shaking so badly that I had to grip the blanket just to keep them still. The fear wasn't fading. It was building. Every minute that passed convinced me more and more that whoever these people were, they weren't simply playing a prank. Normal people don't spend nearly an hour pounding on someone's house in complete silence. At some point, I realized I hadn't heard a single passing car. The entire neighborhood seemed asleep. No porch lights came on. No neighbors yelled for them to stop. If anyone else heard the noise, nobody reacted. That, somehow, made me feel even more alone. Finally, after what felt like forever, the banging stopped again. This time it stayed quiet. I didn't trust it. I kept expecting another loud crash against the window. Nothing happened. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. I still didn't move. I listened for footsteps, for voices, for anything at all. There was only silence. Eventually, the first birds started singing outside. The sky slowly turned from black to dark gray. Only then did I finally force myself to sit up. My whole body ached from staying frozen in one position for so long. I cautiously looked through the front windows. There was nobody there. The porch was empty. The sidewalk was empty. The front yard looked completely normal. If not for the pounding I'd heard for what felt like 40 straight minutes, I would have believed I'd imagined the entire thing. I walked around the outside of the house later that morning. There wasn't any obvious damage. No broken glass. No footprints that I could recognize. Nothing that clearly proved someone had been there. That almost made the experience stranger. It felt like the night had erased itself. But I knew what I'd heard. There was no way I had dreamed it. I barely slept the following night. Every little sound made me jump. The house suddenly felt much larger and much emptier than it ever had before. I kept checking the windows, checking the locks, turning lights on in different rooms just to reassure myself that nobody had somehow gotten inside. By the next afternoon, I couldn't take being alone anymore. I called one of my closest friends and explained everything that had happened. I told him I didn't want to spend the rest of the week by myself. I asked if he'd come over and stay until my family got back. There was a long pause. Then he laughed. "What the hell for?" he asked. "So we can both get murdered in our sleep?" I remember just sitting there holding the phone. "Thanks," I said. "You're a real friend." He laughed even harder. Needless to say, he never came over. So I spent the rest of the week alone in that house. Nothing else happened. No more pounding, no strange visitors, no late-night knocks, but I never relaxed. Every evening, as soon as the sun started going down, I became nervous. Every reflection in those giant front windows made me think someone was standing outside. Every branch moving in the wind looked like a person walking toward the porch. Even now, years later, I still think about that night, whenever I see houses with huge uncovered windows facing the street. People always talk about how beautiful natural light is, and how nice it is to have large windows. They're right. During the day, they're wonderful. At 3 o'clock in the morning, when you're lying alone on a couch and someone starts pounding on the glass directly above your head while another person hammers on your front door without saying a single word, they become one of the most terrifying design choices imaginable. To this day, I have no idea who those people were. Maybe they were drunk. Maybe they were looking for someone else. Maybe it was an elaborate prank. Or maybe they had much worse intentions. I'll probably never know. What I do know is that I have never again slept in that living room, and whenever I stay in a house with large windows facing the street, I make absolutely sure the curtains are closed before the sun goes down. I was 17 years old and had only recently gotten my driver's license. Like most teenagers, finally having my own car felt like freedom. My friends and I were constantly looking for excuses to drive around after school, especially during the summer when the days stayed bright until late in the evening. Looking back now, we weren't exactly making smart decisions. One of our favorite hobbies was finding abandoned buildings. For some reason, we thought they were the perfect places to hang out or throw parties. Every few weeks, someone would hear about an old farmhouse, an empty warehouse, or a house that had supposedly been abandoned for years, and we'd all pile into a car to check it out. Most of the places turned out to be disappointments. Some had already been demolished. Others weren't abandoned at all. A few were simply too dangerous to even walk inside. Still, we kept searching, convinced that somewhere out there was the perfect hidden location. Then, I found what I thought was the jackpot. Every day after work, I drove the same route home, about halfway through the drive. There was a massive, unfinished house sitting well back from the road. It wasn't just an ordinary abandoned home. It looked like someone had started building a huge luxury house and then suddenly stopped. The outside walls were standing. The roof was mostly finished. But there were no windows, no doors, no landscaping, no signs that anyone had ever actually lived there. The driveway was cracked with weeds growing through it. Tall grass surrounded the property. The entire place looked forgotten. Behind the house stretched a huge piece of land that disappeared into trees. From the road, it looked like the perfect place for a group of teenagers looking for somewhere nobody would bother them. Every time I drove past it, I imagined how incredible it would be for a party. Eventually, I mentioned it to one of my closest friends. He was immediately interested. A few days later, we were planning to see a movie together. Before heading to the theater, I suggested we stop by the unfinished house for a quick look, just to check it out. Nothing more. It was early evening. The sun had almost disappeared below the horizon, leaving that strange blue light that comes just before darkness. Because it was getting late, I already had my headlights on. We turned off the main road and drove slowly toward the property. The place looked exactly as empty as it always had. No lights, no cars, no movement. I pulled into the front of the driveway. We both looked around through the windshield. "This is it?" my friend asked. "Yeah," I said. "It's huge." We couldn't have been there for more than 10 seconds, maybe less. We didn't even get out of the car. After realizing we were running late for the movie, I shifted into reverse and backed out toward the road. Everything seemed completely normal, until about a minute later, I noticed headlights appear behind us. At first, I didn't think much about it. It was just a large pickup truck. There was nothing unusual about that. But as the seconds passed, the truck kept getting closer. Then, even closer. Before long, it was practically touching my rear bumper. Its high beams filled every mirror with blinding white light. I could barely see anything behind me except those headlights. My friend glanced into the mirror. This guy's really close. Yeah, I replied. He'll probably pass in a minute. He never did. Instead, he stayed right behind us. Every time I accelerated, he accelerated. Every time I slowed slightly, he slowed too. At first, we laughed it off. Maybe he was just an impatient driver. Maybe he happened to be going the same direction. But after another minute, the atmosphere inside the car started changing. Neither of us was laughing anymore. The truck wasn't trying to pass. It wasn't backing off. It was following us. I kept telling myself I was probably imagining it. Then we reached the traffic light at the main road. I needed to turn right. The truck was directly behind me. The light changed. I made my turn. Instead of following the normal lane behind me, the truck suddenly cut across the gas station sitting on the corner. It drove straight through the parking lot. For a second, I couldn't understand what it was doing. Then it shot out of the other exit directly in front of my car. I slammed on the brakes. The truck stopped sideways across the road. It completely blocked my path. I couldn't drive around it. For a second, neither of us spoke. My friend finally whispered exactly what I was thinking. What the hell? Then the driver's door opened. The man who stepped out looked enormous. Even now, I can still picture him. He was tall, broad, and built like someone who spent every day doing heavy physical work. He wasn't running. He wasn't yelling. He simply walked toward us with complete confidence. My heart started pounding. I had only been driving for a short time. I had no idea what to do. My friend looked just as terrified. Neither of us even considered getting out. The man reached my window. He knocked twice, not loudly, just enough to let me know he expected me to roll it down. For a second, I thought about locking the doors and driving away. The problem was, there was nowhere to go. His truck completely blocked the road. With shaking hands, I lowered the window just a few inches. Before he even spoke, I noticed something strange. The road around us had been fairly busy only moments earlier. Cars had been driving in both directions. Now, nothing. No cars behind us. No cars coming toward us. Even the gas station suddenly looked empty. It was probably just one of those odd coincidences where traffic disappears for a few seconds. At the time, though, it felt incredibly unsettling. The silence made everything worse. The man leaned slightly toward the window. His expression wasn't angry. If anything, it was unreadable. Then he asked one simple question. What were you boys doing at that house? Every excuse I'd been thinking of instantly disappeared. I panicked. The first lie that entered my head came out before I could stop it. We were just turning around, I said quickly. Missed our turn. The man didn't respond immediately. He just looked at me. Then at my friend. Then back at me again. Those few seconds felt unbelievably long. I remember wondering if he knew I was lying. I wondered if he'd seen us pull into the driveway, if he'd been watching the property the entire time. Neither of us spoke. Neither of us moved. Finally, the man smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It wasn't openly threatening either. It was simply strange, almost like he had already decided something. After another few seconds, he nodded. All right, he said quietly. Then he stepped away from the window. Without another word, he returned to his truck. He climbed inside, started the engine, pulled out of the way, and drove off. Neither my friend nor I said anything for nearly a full minute. I just kept driving. Finally, my friend looked over at me. We're not going back there. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. I agreed immediately. The movie suddenly didn't seem nearly as important as it had 20 minutes earlier. Even while sitting in the theater later that night, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. The whole encounter felt wrong. How had the driver known we'd been at the house? He couldn't have reached us that quickly unless he had already been somewhere nearby. Was he watching the property? Living there? Working there? The house looked completely abandoned. There were no lights, no signs of construction, nothing that suggested anyone should have been there at all. Over the following months, I continued driving past the property on my way home from work. Every single time I slowed down just enough to glance toward it. Nothing ever changed. The house remained unfinished. No construction crews ever appeared. No new windows were installed. No landscaping was done. Year after year, it looked exactly the same, like time had completely stopped. Yet after what happened that evening, I could never convince myself it was actually abandoned. Someone cared enough about that property to chase two teenagers several miles down the road. Someone cared enough to block our car and demand to know why we'd been there. That isn't normal behavior. Over the years, I've come up with plenty of possible explanations. Maybe the owner was tired of kids trespassing. Maybe valuable construction equipment had been stolen before. Maybe there had been repeated break-ins. Those are all perfectly reasonable possibilities. But another part of me has always wondered if there was something else happening there. The place was isolated. The property behind the house stretched for acres. There were no nearby neighbors watching what came and went. It would certainly be a convenient location for activities that people wouldn't want anyone else discovering. Was it a drug operation? Illegal storage? Something completely innocent? I honestly have no idea. I've never gone back to find out. What I do know is that the man's reaction wasn't the kind you'd expect from someone protecting an ordinary abandoned construction site. He didn't call the police. He didn't tell us to leave the property. He followed us. He intercepted us. Then he questioned us himself. That alone was enough to convince me that whatever was going on there wasn't something I wanted to become involved with. To this day, whenever I drive past an old abandoned building and wonder what might be inside, I think back to that unfinished house. People often assume abandoned places are empty simply because they look deserted. The truth is, appearances can be incredibly misleading. Sometimes a building looks abandoned because nobody lives there anymore. Other times, it only looks abandoned because the people using it don't want anyone asking questions. After that night, my friends and I quietly gave up exploring abandoned houses. The excitement simply wasn't worth the risk. Because sometimes the scariest thing about an abandoned place isn't finding out that it's haunted. It's discovering that it was never abandoned in the first place. Sorry to pause for just a moment. If this is your first time here, welcome. I hope you're enjoying the calm so far. If you'd like more nights like this, true stories, gentle rain, no interruptions, please subscribe to Lacuna Noir. It really helps me keep creating these peaceful experiences for you. And tap the bell so you're here every time a new story arrives in the dark. Now, back to the story. A month ago, I was sexually assaulted while walking home. It happened so quickly that even now, it's hard to believe how little time passed between the assault and the man being arrested. Within about 15 minutes, the police had found him, arrested him, and charged him with sexual assault. If there's one thing I learned from that night, it's that quick thinking can make an enormous difference. It had been a great evening. I'd spent the night with one of my closest friends, and after saying goodbye, I started the walk home like I had many times before. I live in a large city, and although people always warn you about walking alone at night, I'd never personally experienced anything violent or particularly frightening before. I wasn't careless, though. Over time, I'd developed a routine for choosing my route home. I deliberately avoided streets that were completely deserted, but I also stayed away from roads with heavy traffic. In my mind, the safest option was somewhere in between, a street quiet enough that people living nearby would notice if someone screamed, but not so crowded that someone could easily stop a car without anyone paying attention. That night, I chose one particular street for another reason. A police station was located along the route. I remember thinking that walking past it would make the trip even safer. Looking back, it's strange how confident I felt, only moments before everything changed. I was listening to music through my headphones as I walked north toward the station. I was relaxed, thinking about the evening, planning the next day, completely unaware that someone had apparently been following me. Then, without any warning, I realized there was someone walking directly beside me, so close that I hadn't even noticed him approaching. Before I had time to react, I felt his hand press against the small of my back. A fraction of a second later, his hand moved underneath the long raincoat I was wearing and grabbed me. Everything happened almost instantly. It lasted no more than a second. But that second felt like forever. Shock hit me first, then anger, then fear. I screamed. The sound came out before I even realized I was making it. Instinctively, I jumped backward onto the lawn of a nearby house, putting as much space between us as I could. Instead of running past him or trying to get around him, I stayed where I was and forced him to walk in front of me. I didn't want him behind me anymore. As he continued walking, I ripped one of my earbuds out and shouted as loudly as I could. "Don't touch me. You should never touch a woman like that. I'm calling the police." I wasn't thinking about sounding brave. I wasn't trying to confront him. I was simply reacting. I wanted everyone nearby to hear exactly what had happened. For the first time, he looked back at me. But he didn't stop. He kept walking. The moment I had enough distance between us, I crossed the street while dialing 911. Fortunately, the dispatcher answered immediately. I explained what had just happened as calmly as I could, even though my hands were shaking. They immediately started asking questions. Where was I? Which direction was he walking? What was he wearing? I answered every question as clearly as possible. I described his clothing, his approximate height, his hair color, his skin tone, which side of the street he was on, the direction he was heading, anything I could remember. I was only seconds away from the police station by then. As I approached, several officers came outside almost immediately. I repeated everything again. The description, the direction, every detail I could think of. 2 officers jumped into a patrol car and drove off in the direction I had pointed. The others stayed with me while taking my statement. Only afterward did I realize just how lucky I had been. At almost the exact moment I screamed and jumped away from him, another couple had been getting out of a taxi nearby. They had witnessed enough of the incident to understand that something was seriously wrong. Instead of walking away, they followed me to the police station. Both of them voluntarily gave statements describing what they had seen. They were interviewed separately from me, providing independent witness accounts. At the time, I didn't fully appreciate how important that was. Having witnesses who could support my account made the investigation much stronger. While I was still sitting inside the station giving my statement, one of the officers who had gone looking for the suspect came back into the room. He looked at me and simply said they had found him. He had been arrested. I remember feeling a wave of relief so overwhelming that I almost couldn't process what he was saying. Barely 15 minutes had passed since the assault. He had already been located, arrested, and charged. Everything had happened so quickly that it almost didn't feel real. Once the paperwork was finished, I finally went home. The moment I closed my front door behind me, every emotion I'd been holding back finally caught up with me. I cried harder than I can remember crying in a long time. Until then, I'd been focused entirely on giving information, answering questions, and helping the officers catch him. Once all of that was over, the shock finally settled in. I called my mom. Telling her what had happened was one of the hardest conversations I've ever had. She was supportive, reassuring, and mostly just relieved that I was physically safe. Later that night, I spoke with another close friend as well. Talking helped. So did knowing that the man responsible had already been caught. In the days that followed, the police contacted me several times with updates. They explained the legal process and let me know that he had appeared in court. They also informed me of the conditions placed on him after his arrest. One update surprised me more than the others. He had posted $10,000 in bail the very next day. Hearing that was frustrating. Part of me knew that bail is a normal part of many legal systems and doesn't determine guilt or innocence. Emotionally, though, it was difficult to hear that someone who had assaulted me was no longer in custody. The officers also gave me documentation containing his name and information related to the case. To this day, I haven't wanted to look at it. His name doesn't matter to me. Knowing who he is doesn't change what happened. I've also been told that I'm allowed to contact the police or the court to learn what eventually happened with his case. Whether he pleaded guilty, whether he was convicted, what sentence he received. People sometimes ask why I haven't followed up. The answer is simple. I'm afraid of what I might hear. Part of me worries that there could have been some technical mistake, some legal issue, some outcome where he wasn't held accountable the way I hope he was. Living with uncertainty has strangely become easier than risking hearing something that would reopen the entire experience. Maybe one day I'll want to know. Right now, I don't. The experience itself lasted only a second. The emotional impact lasted much longer. For a while afterward, I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder while walking. Every time someone got too close behind me, my heart started racing. Music no longer felt relaxing while walking alone because I wanted to hear everything happening around me. Little things I'd never thought about before suddenly became habits. Checking reflections in store windows, crossing the street if someone made me uncomfortable, paying attention to escape routes. None of those habits existed before that night. What stayed with me most wasn't just what happened. It was how quickly everything changed. One second, I was simply walking home after a wonderful evening with a friend. The next second, I was screaming at a stranger and calling emergency services. People often imagine traumatic events unfolding over several minutes. This didn't. It happened in less time than it takes to read a text message. One moment of someone else's decision changed the rest of my night completely. At the same time, another truth has stayed with me. Acting immediately mattered. Calling 911 without hesitation mattered. Giving a detailed description mattered. Speaking loudly enough for other people to notice mattered. The witnesses deciding to stay and give statements mattered. The officers responding so quickly mattered. None of those things erased what happened. But together, they meant the person responsible was identified and arrested almost immediately. I wish the assault had never happened. No one should have to experience something like that. But if there's one thing I hope other people take away from my experience, it's this. If you were able to do so safely, trust your instincts, make as much noise as you can, report what happened as quickly as possible, and provide every detail you can remember. Those first few minutes can make an enormous difference. I can't control what happened that night. I can't change the fact that a complete stranger decided to violate my personal space while I was simply walking home. What I can take some comfort in is knowing that he didn't simply disappear into the crowd. He didn't get to continue walking away without consequences. Because of quick action from everyone involved, the witnesses, the dispatcher, and the responding officers, he was found within minutes and forced to answer for what he had done. That doesn't erase the fear or the memories, but it does remind me that sometimes acting immediately can change the outcome in ways that matter. About a week after I earned my CPR certification, I found myself in a situation I never expected. When I signed up for the class, I honestly thought it was just a useful skill to have. I hoped I would never actually need it. Like most people taking a CPR course, I assumed it was something I'd probably forget over time because I'd never have a reason to use it. I couldn't have been more wrong. Only a week later, I was standing in a thrift store with a few friends, shopping for Halloween costumes. It was a completely ordinary afternoon. We were laughing, trying on ridiculous clothes, and joking about who could put together the funniest costume without spending much money. There wasn't anything unusual about the day. At one point, I stepped into one of the dressing rooms to try something on. While I was changing, I noticed the store had suddenly gone quiet. The conversations outside had stopped. Even through the closed dressing room door, I could tell something had happened. Then, I heard someone raise their voice. "There's someone passed out in the parking lot." The tone wasn't panicked at first. It sounded more confused than anything else. I quickly stepped out of the dressing room. Several employees and customers were standing near the entrance, looking outside but not really moving. People seemed unsure what to do. Without thinking too much about it, I spoke up. "I'm CPR certified," I said. "I'll go check on them." Then I looked at one of the employees. "Call 911. I hurried outside. At first I couldn't see anyone lying on the ground. The parking lot looked almost normal. For a second, I wondered if someone had already helped them. Then, another person came running out of the store and pointed toward the far end of the parking lot. "They're in that car." The vehicle was parked by itself, well away from the other cars. I started running. Even before I reached it, I could tell something was terribly wrong. The woman was still sitting in the driver's seat. She wasn't moving. Her head was leaning awkwardly against the window. As I got closer, my stomach dropped. Her face had turned a deep shade of blue. Not pale, not gray. Blue, she looked completely deprived of oxygen. The skin around her eyes had dark circles, and even those seemed bluish from the lack of oxygen reaching her body. For a brief moment, I completely froze. Everything I'd learned during CPR training suddenly felt very far away. This wasn't a training dummy lying on a classroom floor. This was a real person. Someone's daughter. Maybe someone's mother. Someone whose life depended on complete strangers acting immediately. The driver's door was opened. I remember someone helping me, although I honestly can't remember who. Everything happened so fast that parts of it have blurred together over the years. One detail, though, has never left me. Before moving her, we turned her head to check for signs of breathing and to feel for a pulse. As her face turned toward us, I saw tears running down her cheeks. I'll never forget that image. Even now, years later, it's the first thing I think about whenever I remember that day. I have no idea how long she'd been sitting there before anyone found her. I don't know whether those tears had fallen only moments earlier or much earlier than that, but seeing them made the situation feel devastatingly human. This wasn't just another emergency. This was someone who had clearly been alive not long before we arrived. We carefully pulled her out of the driver's seat and laid her flat on the ground. Someone checked for a pulse. They weren't certain they felt one. I checked again. Nothing that I could confidently identify. Her breathing was either absent or so minimal that none of us could detect it. There wasn't time to hesitate. We immediately began CPR. Training tells you to focus on the procedure. Push hard. Push fast. Keep going. In reality, your mind races the entire time. You constantly wonder whether you're doing enough, whether you're pressing in the right place, whether every second you're spending could be the difference between life and death. It felt much longer than it probably was. In reality, the ambulance arrived incredibly quickly. I think it was only about a minute after we started. To me, it felt much longer. The paramedics rushed over with equipment, immediately taking over. They moved with a level of speed and coordination that made it obvious they had done this many times before. They placed her onto a stretcher while continuing chest compressions without stopping. Within seconds, more medical equipment surrounded her. An airway was managed. Monitors were attached. Medications were prepared. Even after they took over, none of us nearby moved. We simply stood there watching, hoping they could somehow bring her back. Then another ambulance arrived. More emergency medical personnel jumped out. Suddenly there were half a dozen people surrounding her, each focused on a specific task. It was incredible to watch how organized everything became despite the obvious urgency. One police officer eventually came over to speak with those of us who had been helping. He explained that the medical team had administered a medication that can sometimes reverse opioid overdoses if it's given early enough. From the way he spoke, though, it was clear they weren't optimistic. He quietly told us that she had probably been without oxygen for too long before anyone found her. The emergency crews would continue every possible life-saving measure while transporting her to the hospital. But he gently prepared us for the reality that the outcome was unlikely to change. Only then did I begin noticing everything inside the car. Scattered across the floor were used needles. There were empty pill bottles. It painted a heartbreaking picture of what had likely happened before anyone even realized she needed help. She wasn't old. That struck me immediately. She looked far younger than I would have expected. As people looked through the vehicle for identification and anything that might help the responders, someone quietly pointed something out. There was a child's car seat in the back. A few toys were scattered nearby. On her body were two names tattooed prominently enough that several of us noticed them. We couldn't know for certain what those names meant. Maybe they belonged to her children. Maybe they were family members. Maybe they represented something entirely different. But standing there, looking at the car seat and the toys, it was impossible not to wonder whether children were waiting for someone who might never come home. That thought stayed with me almost as much as the tears on her face. Eventually, the ambulances left. The flashing lights disappeared down the road. The parking lot slowly returned to normal. Customers went back inside. Cars continued driving past as though nothing extraordinary had happened. It felt surreal. Only minutes earlier, a group of strangers had been desperately trying to save someone's life. Now the world continued as if nothing had happened. My friends and I eventually left as well. The excitement of shopping for Halloween costumes was gone. None of us talked very much on the drive home. I replayed the entire event over and over in my mind. I kept questioning myself. Had I started CPR quickly enough? Had I done everything correctly? Could I have done anything differently? Those thoughts stayed with me for quite a while. Later, I came to understand that this kind of self-questioning is common after responding to a medical emergency. When someone experiences cardiac arrest or a severe overdose outside a hospital, the chances of survival often depend on many factors that are completely beyond the control of bystanders. How long they've been without oxygen, how quickly someone finds them, how soon emergency services arrive, whether appropriate medications can be given in time. Those are things no bystander can control. Still, it's difficult not to wonder. I was only 19 years old at the time. Until that afternoon, the most stressful thing I'd dealt with was studying for exams and figuring out what I wanted to do with my life. Suddenly, I found myself kneeling beside someone who appeared to be dying. It forced me to grow up very quickly. For a while afterward, I couldn't stop thinking about addiction. Before that day, it had been easy to think of drug overdoses as statistics you hear about on the news. That experience changed everything. Instead of a statistic, I saw a real person, someone who had cried, someone who almost certainly had people who loved her, someone whose life had become so consumed by addiction that it ended alone in a parking lot. Whatever choices had led her there, the ending was simply tragic. To this day, I don't know whether she survived after leaving in the ambulance. Part of me hopes she somehow did. Another part of me recognizes how serious her condition appeared before help arrived. I may never know the outcome, and perhaps that's for the best. What I do know is that taking that CPR course turned out to matter far more than I ever imagined. Even if the outcome couldn't be changed, standing there and trying was better than standing back and doing nothing. That experience also taught me something else. Emergencies don't wait until you're older, more experienced, or emotionally prepared. They happen without warning, in the middle of completely ordinary days when you're shopping for Halloween costumes with your friends or running simple errands. One moment you're laughing about which costume looks the funniest. The next, you're doing everything you can to keep another human being alive until professional help arrives. I hope I never have to perform CPR in a real emergency again. But if I ever do, I know I'll step forward, just as I did that afternoon. Because sometimes the only thing you can give another person is a chance. Even when the odds are against them, that chance is worth everything. My grandmother told this story for the rest of her life, and no matter how many times anyone questioned it, she never changed a single detail. She believed every word of it until the day she died. Whether it was a ghost, an angel, or simply something that can't be explained, she always insisted that someone, or something, saved both her life and my father's during one of the darkest periods of the Second World War. The story took place during the Blitz, when London was being bombed night after night. Life during those years was filled with uncertainty. Air raid sirens could sound at any hour. Families often went to bed not knowing if their homes would still be standing by morning. People became used to sleeping in shelters, carrying only what they could grab in a few moments if the alarm started. My father was only a baby at the time. My grandmother was raising him while trying to survive in a city that seemed to be under constant attack. One night, their own home was hit during an air raid. The bombing destroyed the house, leaving them with nowhere to live. Like many others who lost everything during the war, they depended on the kindness of friends and neighbors. A close friend offered them somewhere to stay until they could figure out what to do next. The house wasn't large, but it was safe enough. The friend prepared a small bedroom for my grandmother on the top floor. It wasn't much, just a bed and enough space for a baby's cot. After everything they had already been through, it felt like a blessing simply to have a roof over their heads. That evening seemed unusually quiet. The air raid sirens had been silent for a while, and although everyone knew another bombing raid could happen at any time, people tried their best to continue living as normally as possible. As night approached, my grandmother picked up my father and carried him upstairs to put him to bed. She later described the staircase in remarkable detail. It was narrow, with worn wooden steps that creaked beneath every footstep. The hallway above was dimly lit, and shadows filled the corners because very few lights were used during the blackout. She had climbed most of the staircase when something happened that she never forgot. Halfway to the bedroom, someone appeared in front of her. Not someone walking down the stairs, not someone stepping out of another room. According to her, the figure simply appeared. She always struggled to describe exactly what she saw. It looked like a person, not transparent, not glowing, just there, standing calmly on the staircase. She couldn't clearly make out a face. Years later, whenever anyone asked whether it was a man or a woman, she would simply shake her head. "I don't know," she always answered. "I only know someone was there." The figure didn't move toward her. It didn't raise its voice. It simply looked directly at her and spoke. "Don't sleep in that room tonight." That was all. No explanation. No warning beyond those few words. My grandmother stood frozen. For a few seconds, she couldn't even think. She looked at the figure. Then she blinked, and it was gone. There was nowhere for anyone to have disappeared. The staircase was enclosed. There were no doors nearby. No sound of footsteps. No movement. One moment, someone had been standing there. The next moment, they had vanished completely. She didn't continue upstairs. Instead, she turned around immediately. Still holding my father, she walked straight back downstairs. Her friend looked surprised. "What's wrong?" she asked. My grandmother didn't know how to explain what had just happened. How do you tell someone you've just spoken to a person who vanished into thin air? Instead, she simply said she had changed her mind. She wasn't sleeping upstairs that night. She wanted to sleep downstairs in the sitting room with the baby instead. Her friend wasn't happy about it. The sitting room wasn't meant to be used as a bedroom. It would be inconvenient. The upstairs room had already been prepared. After everything everyone had already endured during the war, the last thing anyone wanted was another complication. The two women argued briefly. Nothing dramatic, just the kind of tired disagreement that happens when people are already exhausted from stress and uncertainty. Eventually, her friend gave in. She wasn't pleased, but she agreed. My grandmother carried my father into the sitting room. She made a temporary bed for herself, as best she could. She placed his small cot nearby. The upstairs room remained completely empty. Later that night, the air raid sirens began. The familiar sound echoed through the streets of London. People rushed toward shelters. Others stayed where they were, hoping their homes would survive another night. Then, the bombing started. Explosions thundered across the city. The ground shook. Windows rattled. No one knew exactly where the bombs were falling until morning. At some point during the night, one explosion landed frighteningly close to the house. The blast was powerful enough to shake the entire building. Dust filled the air. Parts of the ceiling cracked. Everyone inside waited for the bombing to stop. When daylight finally arrived and they were able to look upstairs, they found the damage. Part of the roof had collapsed. Heavy beams, broken bricks, and shattered roofing had crashed directly into the upstairs bedroom. The bed was buried beneath rubble. The small cot where my father would have been sleeping had been completely crushed. There would have been no chance of survival. My grandmother stood silently in the doorway, staring at the destruction. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply held my father a little tighter. If she had ignored the warning, if she had climbed those final few steps, if she had gone to bed exactly as planned, neither she nor my father would likely have survived the night. From that day forward, she never doubted what she had experienced. Family members occasionally suggested other explanations over the years. Perhaps the stress of war had caused her to imagine it. Perhaps exhaustion had played tricks on her mind. Perhaps she had unconsciously sensed something about the house that made her uneasy. She listened politely whenever someone offered another theory. Then she always gave the same answer. "No, I know what I saw." She insisted that the figure had spoken clearly. She insisted it had warned her. And she insisted that the upstairs room had become a death trap only hours later. As the years passed, she told the story to her children, then her grandchildren. Every single time, the details remained exactly the same. She never exaggerated it. She never added dramatic flourishes. She never claimed to know who the figure had been, only that it had appeared, given its warning, and disappeared. She often wondered why she had been the one who received it. During the Blitz, countless innocent people died. Many never received any warning at all. Why her? Why that night? Why my father? Those questions never had answers. She accepted that they probably never would. Some people believed she had encountered a guardian angel. Others thought perhaps it had been the spirit of someone connected to the house. A few dismissed the entire story as nothing more than a coincidence shaped by memory over many years. She never argued with anyone. She simply smiled and repeated what she had always said. I know what happened. By the end of her life, she had forgotten many ordinary things. Names occasionally escaped her. Dates became confused. Stories from decades earlier sometimes blended together, but this memory never faded. She could still describe the staircase, the silence, the figure standing there. The exact words she heard. Don't sleep in that room tonight. She believed those 6 words changed the course of her family's history. Had she ignored them, my father would almost certainly have died as a baby beneath the collapsing roof. And because he survived, the rest of our family exists today. Whether the figure was supernatural, a guardian sent to protect them, or something that can never be explained, I honestly don't know. Neither did my grandmother. She never claimed to understand what she had seen. She only knew that she trusted the warning. And because she did, 2 lives were spared on a night when so many others across London were not. My grandmother was about 7 years old during the Second World War, growing up in Germany while the bombing campaigns were at their worst. She told this story many times throughout her life, and every time she did, she described it with the same quiet certainty. She never forgot that night. By then, air raids had become a terrifying part of everyday life. The sound of sirens could interrupt dinner, wake people in the middle of the night, or send entire neighborhoods scrambling for shelter. No one knew where the next bombs would fall, and every evening carried the possibility that someone's home might not still be standing by morning. For children, it became an unsettling kind of normal. They learned to sleep through distant explosions. They learned to recognize the sound of aircraft overhead. They learned to keep a few belongings ready in case they had to leave at a moment's notice. My grandmother and her family lived in a small town that had become a regular target during the war. Bombing raids weren't rare events anymore. They happened often enough that everyone lived with a constant sense of uncertainty. Despite everything, families still tried to carry on with daily life. Children still played outside when they could. Parents still prepared meals and tried to create some feeling of normal life, even while the war crept closer with every passing month. One evening, everything seemed ordinary. The family had finished their evening routine and were getting ready for bed. There was no sign that this night would be any different from the many frightening nights that had come before it. Then, something unexpected happened. My grandmother's younger brother suddenly became unusually upset. He started crying, not the kind of crying that children often do when they're tired or don't want to go to bed. According to my grandmother, he was completely inconsolable. He begged their parents over and over again to let him spend the night at the neighbor's house. At first, his parents didn't understand. There was no special occasion. Nothing exciting planned. The neighbors were family friends, but there was no particular reason for him to stay there that evening. Naturally, they asked him why. He couldn't really explain. He simply kept insisting. He didn't want to sleep at home. He wanted to stay with the neighbors. He cried, pleaded, refused to calm down. Eventually, his parents gave in. Perhaps they thought he simply wanted an adventure. Perhaps they were too tired to argue anymore after months of living under the stress of war. Whatever their reason, they agreed. Instead of spending the night in their own home, the entire family gathered a few things and went next door to stay with the neighbors. No one thought much of it afterward. It seemed like an ordinary family decision. A child wanted to stay somewhere else for the night. His parents agreed. That was all. Later that night, the air raid began. The now familiar sound of aircraft echoed overhead. Then came the explosions. Bombs fell across the town, shaking buildings and filling the night with smoke, dust, and fire. Like so many families during the war, they could do little except wait and hope their home would survive. When daylight finally arrived and it was safe enough to return, they walked back toward their house. Or at least, toward where their house had once stood. There was almost nothing left. The bombing had completely destroyed it. Walls had collapsed. The roof had disappeared beneath piles of broken timber and bricks. Furniture, belongings, clothing, everything they owned had either been crushed or buried beneath the rubble. The place where they would all have been sleeping only hours earlier no longer existed. Had they stayed home that night, it's very unlikely any of them would have survived. My grandmother always believed that her little brother had somehow sensed something was wrong. She never claimed he had seen a vision. She never said he predicted the bombing. She simply couldn't explain why he became so desperate to leave the house that particular evening. Neither could anyone else. Children often ask to spend the night somewhere else, but they don't usually become so distressed that an entire family changes its plans because of it. Yet, that simple decision saved every one of them. As the years passed, relatives occasionally suggested ordinary explanations. Maybe he had simply wanted to visit the neighbors. Maybe it was nothing more than an incredible coincidence. After all, wartime bombing was unpredictable, and many homes were destroyed without warning. Those explanations are certainly possible. Even so, my grandmother always admitted there was one thing she could never fully understand. Why that specific night? Why that level of urgency? Why did a little boy who couldn't explain himself become so determined that his entire family abandoned their own home for just a single evening? She never found an answer. The story stayed with her for the rest of her life. As children and grandchildren grew older, she would tell it from time to time, not as a ghost story or something supernatural, but simply as one of the many strange moments that can happen during extraordinary times. War is filled with stories of unimaginable tragedy. Entire families disappeared overnight. Cities were reduced to rubble. Lives changed forever in a matter of seconds. But every so often, amid all that destruction, there are stories that seem almost impossible to explain. Moments where one unexpected decision changes everything. Whenever I think about my family's history, I sometimes realize just how fragile it really is. If my great-uncle hadn't started crying that evening, if his parents had refused to let him stay with the neighbors, if they had dismissed it as an ordinary childhood tantrum, there's a very real chance my grandmother would have died that night. My parent would never have been born. Neither would I. It's strange to think that my entire existence may have depended on the unexplained instincts of a frightened little boy during one ordinary evening in the middle of the Second World War. Whether it was intuition, coincidence, or something no one could ever explain, we'll never know. What we do know is that one child's desperate request changed the fate of an entire family. Sometimes history turns on enormous events that fill textbooks. Other times, it turns on something as small as a 7-year-old's little brother refusing to sleep in his own bed. In 2004, I was 17 years old, fresh out of high school, and living away from home for the first time. I had grown up in the countryside where life felt quiet and predictable. Everyone knew everyone else. People rarely locked their doors, and walking alone at night wasn't something anyone thought twice about. Moving to a large city for college was a completely different world. Everything felt exciting. The streets were always busy. There were restaurants open late, music coming from bars, and people everywhere. I thought I was adapting quickly. Looking back now, I realize I was mostly just young, overconfident, and completely unaware of how vulnerable I really was. One weekend, I stayed out later than usual. It was around 1:30 in the morning when I decided it was time to head back to my dorm. I could have called someone. I could have taken a taxi. I could have asked a friend to walk with me. Instead, I convinced myself I could easily find my own way back. After all, how hard could it be? I had only been in the city a short time and didn't actually know the streets very well, but I figured I'd recognize enough landmarks to make it back. That confidence disappeared almost immediately. Within minutes, I realized I had no idea where I was. The streets looked unfamiliar. The shops I'd seen earlier were gone. The sidewalks were almost empty. I kept walking, hoping I'd eventually recognize something. Instead, the neighborhood became noticeably worse. Streetlights were broken, leaving long stretches of the road in darkness. Trash covered the sidewalks and collected in overflowing alleyways. Many of the row houses looked abandoned or barely standing, with broken windows and peeling paint. The few buildings that still seemed occupied echoed with shouting. Arguments drifted through open windows. Somewhere nearby, glass shattered. The entire area felt tense. Even at 17, I knew enough to realize I had wandered somewhere I absolutely did not belong. Honestly, I wouldn't have wanted to walk through that neighborhood in broad daylight. At 1:30 in the morning, completely alone, it felt terrifying. I tried to stay calm. I kept telling myself that if I just kept walking, I'd eventually reach a busier street. Then I heard a car behind me. At first, I assumed it was simply passing through. I stepped slightly closer to the edge of the sidewalk to give it room. Instead of driving past, it slowed down. Very slowly. It stayed beside me. I continued walking. So did the car. For nearly an entire block, it matched my pace exactly. Every instinct I had started screaming that something was wrong. I glanced sideways. Inside were 5 men. Even now, years later, I can't remember their faces clearly. I only remember the feeling that settled into my stomach the moment I looked inside. None of them looked like they were simply driving somewhere. Every one of them was watching me. No one spoke. The silence somehow made it worse. I tried looking straight ahead, pretending I hadn't noticed them. My heart was pounding so hard that I could hear it. I considered running. But where? The streets were almost empty. They had a car. I was on foot. If they wanted to catch me, they easily could. A short distance ahead was an intersection. For one hopeful second, I thought they'd simply continue straight. Instead, they turned left. Then they stopped. Right in the middle of the street. Directly in front of me, blocking the path I was already walking toward. The moment I realized what they had done, pure panic took over. People often imagine they'll fight or run in terrifying situations. I did neither. I froze. Completely. I just stood there staring at the car. My mind went absolutely blank. I couldn't think of a single thing to do. Running didn't seem possible. Turning around meant walking back toward the same dark streets I'd just come from. There were no open stores, no obvious place to hide, no one else walking nearby. I honestly believed I was completely alone. Time seemed to slow down. I have no idea whether I stood there for 5 seconds or 30. It felt much longer. No one got out of the car. No one rolled down a window. Everything was eerily still. Then something completely unexpected happened. A porch light switched on. The house just beyond the stopped car suddenly lit up. The bright light spilled across the front steps and onto part of the street. A moment later, the front door opened. A man casually walked outside carrying a bag of trash. He looked like someone doing the most ordinary chore imaginable. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't looking around nervously. He simply walked toward the trash cans as though it were any other night. The effect was immediate. The car accelerated. Within seconds, it drove away. No hesitation, no lingering. It simply disappeared down the street. Only after it was gone did I realize how hard I had been shaking. The fear I'd been holding inside came crashing down all at once. I burst into tears. Not quiet crying. Completely uncontrollable sobbing. The man carrying the trash immediately noticed me. He stopped what he was doing and walked over. I must have looked like a complete mess. I was crying so hard that I could barely speak. He asked if I was all right. I tried explaining what had just happened. Looking back, I doubt my explanation made much sense. Between the shaking, the tears, and the adrenaline, I was probably speaking in broken sentences. Still, he understood enough. Instead of brushing me off or assuming I was overreacting, he took me seriously. He invited me inside so I could calm down. Normally, walking into a stranger's home would have been another terrible decision. But after what had just happened, I honestly felt safer with him than standing alone outside. Inside the house, he gave me a soda and let me sit down until I stopped shaking. His roommate came out after hearing what had happened. Both of them were incredibly kind. Neither of them made me feel embarrassed. Neither questioned whether I had misunderstood the situation. They simply wanted to make sure I got home safely. After I had calmed down enough to think clearly, they insisted on walking me all the way back to my dorm. The entire walk, they stayed with me. We talked about school, comedy, and completely ordinary things, probably because they knew I needed something else to focus on. Before leaving, they mentioned that they performed stand-up comedy together and invited me to come see one of their shows sometime. I actually wanted to. Unfortunately, the shows were held in bars and I was still too young to get in, so I never saw either of them again. Over the years, I've forgotten almost everything about them. I can't remember their names. I can't remember exactly what they looked like. I don't even remember what neighborhood they lived in. But I have never forgotten what they did for me. Sometimes I think about how unbelievably small the timing was. What if he hadn't decided to take the trash out right then? What if he'd waited another 5 minutes? What if he'd taken it out earlier? The porch light might never have come on while that car was still there. Maybe the men would have driven away anyway. Maybe they had no intention of doing anything. I honestly can't know for certain. But standing there that night, alone in a dark neighborhood with 5 strangers blocking my path, it certainly didn't feel harmless. I've replayed that moment in my head many times over the years. The truth is, I made a series of incredibly poor decisions. I walked alone in a city I barely knew. I stayed out much later than I had planned. I didn't arrange transportation. I assumed nothing bad would happen, simply because nothing bad ever had before. I was extremely lucky. Luck isn't something anyone should rely on. That night taught me lessons I'll never forget. Today, I pay attention to where I'm going. I share my location with people when traveling alone. If I feel uncomfortable, I trust that feeling instead of talking myself out of it. And I never assume that being young or optimistic somehow makes me immune to danger. At the same time, that night also reminded me of something else. For every story about people who want to harm strangers, there are stories about people who quietly step in to help. A man taking out his trash. A roommate willing to escort a frightened stranger home. Two people who had absolutely no obligation to help me, yet chose kindness anyway. I never got the chance to thank them properly. I hope they know that one ordinary decision, to take the trash out before bed, became one of the moments I'll remember for the rest of my life. I don't know what might have happened if they hadn't walked outside when they did. Maybe nothing. Maybe something far worse. I'll never know. What I do know is that because one porch light came on at exactly the right moment, I made it safely back to my dorm that night. And more than 20 years later, I still think about those two strangers with gratitude. About 10 years ago, my family experienced something that still doesn't have an explanation. At least, not one that satisfies everyone. I only heard the story from my mother fairly recently, but the people involved have always told it exactly the same way. No one in my family has ever been interested in ghost stories or paranormal experiences. We weren't the kind of people who claimed every strange noise was a spirit or every coincidence was a supernatural sign. If anything, my family has always been skeptical. That's probably one of the reasons this story stayed with me. It didn't come from someone who wanted to believe. It came from people who couldn't explain what they had seen. The story centers around my cousin. She was only 17 or 18 years old when she was involved in a serious car accident. She survived the initial crash but was badly injured. For the next couple of weeks, she remained in the hospital while everyone hoped she would recover. Unfortunately, she never did. She passed away from her injuries not long afterward. Her death devastated the entire family. She was young, full of energy, and incredibly close to everyone, especially my dad's sister. My aunt adored her. The feeling was mutual. Whenever my aunt needed help with her young children, my cousin was always happy to babysit. She spent so much time at their house that she almost felt like another member of the household. The children absolutely loved her. At the time, they were all under the age of 4. To them, she wasn't just an older cousin. She was someone who played games with them, made them laugh, and was always around. Not long before the accident, my aunt's house had gone through major renovations. Construction crews had been coming and going almost every day. Because the project wasn't finished when my cousin died, the work continued afterward. For several weeks, builders remained at the property, completing everything that still needed to be done. Life, as it often does, had to continue despite the family's grief. Then, something unusual started happening. One afternoon, while my aunt was at work, she received a phone call from one of the construction workers. She assumed he was calling about supplies or some decision that needed to be made regarding the renovation. Instead, he sounded irritated. He asked if she knew the teenage girl who kept coming onto the property. Confused, my aunt asked what he meant. The worker explained that for the past couple of weeks, a young girl had been appearing around the construction site. She never spoke to anyone. She simply walked slowly around the property, looking at different parts of the house before disappearing again. According to him, it had happened several times. At first, the workers assumed she was a relative or perhaps a neighbor curious about the renovations. Eventually, though, they became frustrated because she kept returning. The worker wanted to know if my aunt could tell the girl to stop wandering around the construction area before someone got hurt. My aunt was puzzled. She couldn't think of any teenager who would have a reason to visit the house repeatedly. She started asking questions. How old is she? What does she look like? The construction worker began describing her. Long brown hair, a red baseball cap, denim overalls, a white jacket. As he continued talking, my aunt reportedly felt the blood drain from her face. Every single detail matched my cousin. Not just someone who looked vaguely similar, the exact clothes she had been known for wearing. The same long brown hair, the same baseball cap, the same overalls, the same white jacket. The worker had never met my cousin. He had started working on the house only after the renovations began. As far as anyone knew, none of the construction crew had ever seen her before she died. My aunt didn't know what to say. She simply finished the conversation and drove home after work. When she arrived, the workers were still there. Without saying much, she went inside the house and found a photograph of my cousin. She carried it outside. Then she showed it to the workers. "Is this the girl you've been seeing?" According to my mother, every one of them immediately gave the same answer. Yes, that was her. The girl in the photograph was the same teenager who had been walking quietly around the property over the previous weeks. No hesitation. No uncertainty. They all recognized her. Only then did my aunt tell them the truth. The girl in the photograph had died several weeks earlier. The workers reportedly fell silent. None of them had expected that answer. None of them could explain how they had all independently identified someone who was no longer alive. After that conversation, I don't know whether the sightings continued. My mother never mentioned it, and no one else in the family ever added anything more to the story. What stayed with everyone wasn't weeks of ghostly encounters. It was that single realization. Several people had confidently described the same young woman, a woman they shouldn't have been able to recognize. Over the years, I've thought about possible explanations. Perhaps they saw someone who happened to resemble my cousin. Perhaps memories became mixed together after the fact. Perhaps grief influenced how people interpreted the situation. All of those are reasonable possibilities. Memory isn't perfect, especially after emotional events. But there's one detail that has always made me pause. The workers contacted my aunt first. They weren't told about my cousin before describing the girl. They weren't shown a photograph until afterward. They volunteered the description before anyone connected it to someone who had died. That's the part of the story my family has never been able to explain. Before hearing this, I honestly can't remember anyone in my family talking seriously about ghosts or paranormal experiences. We weren't believers. We didn't grow up sharing spooky stories around the dinner table. If someone claimed to have seen a ghost, most of us would probably have looked for an ordinary explanation first. That's still true today. I don't know what those construction workers saw. Maybe there is a perfectly logical explanation that no one ever discovered. Maybe there isn't. All I know is that every person involved told the same story. A group of builders repeatedly saw a quiet teenage girl walking around a house under construction. When they finally described her to the homeowner, they unknowingly described a young woman who had died only weeks earlier. Sometimes I wonder why. If it really happened the way they believed it did, she would have returned there. Then I remember how much time she spent in that house. She had helped care for those children. She had laughed there, babysat there, shared countless ordinary moments there. If there was one place outside her own home that held happy memories, it was probably that house. Whether what the workers saw was a coincidence, a misunderstanding, or something no one can explain, I'll probably never know. But it's still one of the strangest stories my family has ever told. And the fact that it came from people who never believed in the paranormal is what makes it so difficult for me to forget. Look, if you're still watching, you already know what this channel is. No jump scares, no fake drama, just real stories about real people who survive things most of us can't even imagine. And that's scarier than any movie could ever be. If you want more of this raw, unfiltered truth, told the way it deserves to be told, subscribe to Lacuna Noir. We're not here to waste your time. We're here to tell the stories that actually matter. Thanks for listening. Now go get some sleep, if you can.